The first thing Elias Trent saw beneath his tobacco field was not the stone. It was the darkness behind it. On October 17, 1897, his plough struck something 6 feet beneath the soil and stopped the mule hard enough to nearly throw him into the furrow. Elias climbed down, expecting limestone. Instead, the ground collapsed. A section of earth disappeared beneath his boots, opening into a narrow black void. He dropped to his knees and lowered his lantern through the gap. The flame revealed a wall, not a pile of stones, not an old foundation. A wall made from enormous blocks of dressed sandstone, fitted so tightly together that Elias could barely find a seam. He sat there in the cold morning mud, staring at it. His family had farmed that hollow for 3 generations. There had never been a building there. By noon, Elias had widened the opening enough to climb inside. The chamber smelled of wet earth and something older he couldn't identify. The sandstone continued farther than his lantern could reach. Along one wall, half buried beneath fallen soil, he found what looked like the remains of a wooden door. It stood nearly 8 feet tall. There were no hinges, no latch, no handle, only a strange carving in the centre. A circle surrounded by 7 lines. Elias touched it with 2 fingers. Then he heard something beneath his feet, 3 dull knocks. He froze. He waited. Nothing. He knocked once against the stone. A few seconds later something answered from somewhere deeper underground. 3 knocks. Elias climbed out and did not go back inside. His 12-year-old son, Samuel, found him standing beside the hole. "What did you find?" Elias looked at his boy, then toward the woods covering the ridge above their farm. Something that wasn't supposed to be here. By the following afternoon, word had reached the nearest town, and then a stranger arrived. He called himself Professor Nathaniel Vail and claimed to represent a scientific institution in Washington. He brought 2 men who carried shovels, lanterns, wooden crates, and enough equipment to make it clear they had not come simply to look. Vail examined the exposed stone for less than a minute. When he noticed the 7 lines carved inside the circle, his expression changed. Elias noticed. "You've seen that before?" Vail looked at him. No. The answer came too quickly. He offered Elias $75 for temporary access to the property. Elias needed the money. His tobacco crop had been poor. Winter was coming, and Samuel had already outgrown his only pair of decent boots, so he agreed. But before the men began digging, Vail pulled Elias aside. His voice dropped. "Mr. Trent, whatever you find below that field, don't touch it." Elias frowned. "Why?" Vail looked toward the opening. "Because some things are better left where they were put." That night, after Elias's family had gone to bed, wagons began climbing the dirt road toward the farm. They arrived without lanterns, and they stayed until morning. By sunrise, the men had removed something from beneath Elias Trent's field, something heavy enough to require 4 men to carry, and whatever it was, they covered it with canvas before Elias could see what lay underneath. By the second morning, Elias Trent understood that Professor Nathaniel Vail had never come to Blackwater to study the buried structure. He had come prepared to remove it. Before sunrise, 4 wagons stood behind Elias's tobacco barn. Their wheels were wrapped in burlap to keep them from making noise on the frozen road. The 2 strangers who had arrived with Vail worked without speaking. They had brought pry bars, block and tackle equipment, canvas sheets, wooden cases, and several oil lamps. None of it looked like the equipment of men making an academic survey. It looked like a removal crew. Elias watched from the barn doorway while Vail stood beside the excavation with a notebook in one hand. Every few minutes, the professor looked toward the farmhouse, toward Elias's wife, Martha, toward Samuel, then back at the hole. Elias finally walked over. "You said this was temporary." "It is." "You said you didn't know what it was." Vail closed the notebook. "I don't." "Then why are you taking pieces of it?" Vail studied him for several seconds. "Because we don't know enough to leave them here." That answer bothered Elias more than a lie would have. Around 9 o'clock, the men uncovered the first object. It was a shallow clay vessel about 14 inches wide, buried beneath loose soil near the stone wall. Its surface was dark brown and strangely smooth. Around its rim was the same circular symbol Elias had seen on the door. 7 lines. The men stopped working. One of them whispered something to Vale. Elias couldn't hear the words, but he saw Vale's face. The professor immediately ordered the vessel wrapped in cloth. Elias stepped closer. "What is that?" Vale didn't answer. "That's on the door." "I noticed." "Who made it?" Vale looked toward the ridge. "I told you, Mr. Trent. We don't know." "Then why are you afraid of it?" the professor. His eyes returned to him. "I didn't say I was afraid." That afternoon, Elias saw them remove 3 more objects: a stone weight, a bundle of brittle bones, and a narrow metal vessel unlike anything Elias had seen in Kentucky. By evening, 2 wooden crates had been loaded onto the wagons. Elias approached one before they covered it. Inside were fragments of painted plaster, red pigment, black pigment, and the partial outline of something that looked almost like a human figure. But its head was drawn inside a circle. Vale slammed the lid shut. "You've seen enough." Elias stepped back. "I own this land, and I paid you for access. You paid me $75. "Yes." "For how long?" Vale hesitated. Then he said, "Until we're finished." That was the first moment Elias realized there had never been a real agreement. Only an amount of money and an assumption that a poor farmer would be grateful enough not to ask questions. That night, Elias sat at the kitchen table counting the money. $75. More than his family had held at one time in years. Martha watched him silently. Finally she asked, "What did they find?" Elias looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the excavation lamps moved between the fields like small floating stars. "I don't know." Martha knew he was lying, not because she had seen the excavation, because Elias had spent 20 years farming that land, and she had never once seen him afraid of dirt. The wagons left before dawn, but Vale did not leave with them. He remained behind with one of the strangers, and just before sunrise Elias saw the professor standing alone beside the hole, staring down at the buried door. He wasn't taking notes anymore. He was listening. 3 knocks came from beneath the ground. Vale stepped backward. For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely frightened. Elias did not sleep much after the wagons left. For 3 nights he woke before dawn and listened to the farmhouse settle around him. The stove clicked as it cooled. Wind pushed against the loose boards of the porch. Somewhere beyond the barn, a fox barked once and then went quiet. But beneath all of it, Elias kept remembering the 3 knocks. He never told Martha about them. He never told Samuel. Instead, he went back to work. That was what men like Elias did when something frightened them. They ploughed, they repaired fences, they fed livestock, they found another task and kept their hands moving. By November, the excavation had been filled in. Vale had left behind no report, no official letter, no receipt describing what had been removed, only $75 and a single sheet of paper bearing Elias's signature. The paper stated that he had granted temporary access to his property for scientific examination. Nothing more. Elias kept it inside a tobacco tin beneath his bed. He also kept something else, a small piece of sandstone he had secretly taken from the excavation. It was no larger than his palm. On one side was a fragment of the 7-rayed circle. Elias wrapped it in cloth and hid it inside the wall behind the kitchen stove. He told himself he kept it because someday someone might ask what had been there. But as the years passed, he began to understand another reason. He was afraid someone might come back. They never did, at least not openly. Professor Vale disappeared from Elias's life as quickly as he had entered it. Elias wrote to the Washington institution named on the man's business card. The letter came back unopened. He tried again 6 months later. This time there was no reply. When Elias asked the county clerk whether anyone had filed a survey concerning his property, the clerk searched the records and found no archaeological site, no underground structure, no excavation permit. Nothing. The official county map showed only one thing beneath Elias's land: tobacco. By 1902, Elias had almost convinced himself that the whole episode had been some strange mistake. Then Samuel asked him a question. They were sitting on the porch one summer evening. Samuel was 17 by then, and he had started helping his father with the fields full-time. "Pa, what was under that field?" Elias stared toward the ridge. "You remember that?" "I remember the wagons." Elias rubbed his thumb across the edge of his tobacco knife. "Some kind of old stonework." "Indian?" "I don't know." "Then why'd those men take it?" Elias didn't answer. Samuel waited. Finally, Elias said something he would repeat years later to his granddaughter. "That field is the top of something." He paused. "And whatever is underneath it was buried for a reason." Samuel laughed nervously. "You really believe that?" Elias looked at him. "Yes." He never dug there again. The upper part of the field remained productive for another decade. Then the family gradually moved their crops toward the western slope. The place where Elias had found the structure became a patch of poor soil surrounded by better tobacco. Nobody understood why. Then, in the spring of 1908, a farmer named Jonah Bell was repairing a fence on the opposite side of the ridge. His post hole went down less than 3 feet. The ground gave way. Jonah disappeared to his waist. When he climbed out, he found a stone opening beneath the field. This one wasn't a chamber. It was a corridor, and according to Jonah, it went much farther than anyone expected. Jonah Bell found the second entrance on April 6, 1908, less than 11 years after Elias Trent had been paid to forget his own discovery. The opening appeared beneath a fence line on the eastern side of the ridge, nearly a mile from Elias's tobacco field. Jonah was 61 years old and had no interest in archaeology. He wanted a fence post. That was all. He drove his iron bar into the ground, struck something hollow, and watched the earth collapse around his boots. When he lowered a lantern through the opening, he saw a narrow stone corridor disappearing into darkness. The walls were made from the same pale sandstone found beneath Elias's field. Jonah knew that immediately. He also knew enough about the ridge to understand that there shouldn't have been a tunnel beneath it. The nearest natural cave was more than 4 miles away. Jonah climbed out and went home. He didn't tell his wife until after supper. By the next afternoon, 3 men had seen the entrance. By the end of the week, nearly everybody in the hollow knew. The local sheriff, Caleb Rusk, came out on Saturday. He carried a shotgun, not because he expected trouble, but because that was what men carried when they walked into unfamiliar places. Jonah led him to the opening. The two descended together. The corridor was barely 6 feet wide. Its ceiling rose another 7 feet above them. The floor was unusually level. That bothered Rusk. Natural tunnels were rarely that clean. Every 20 yards or so, a shallow niche had been cut into the wall. Most were empty. One contained a broken clay vessel. Another held several pieces of pottery decorated with thin black lines. At the far end of the first passage, Jonah found something else. A stone slab. On it was the same circular symbol. 7 lines radiating outward. Rusk touched it. "Seen this before?" Jonah shook his head. But another man had. Elias Trent. When Rusk brought him to the entrance 3 days later, Elias stood silently for almost a minute. He recognized the sandstone. He recognized the workmanship. And when he saw the symbol, the color drained from his face. "That's what was on the door," he said. Jonah frowned. "What door?" Elias looked at him. "The one under my field." That was the first time the 2 discoveries were publicly connected. It should have led to questions. Instead, the county judge ordered the entrance closed. No excavation was authorized. No newspaper story was published. Jonah was told the corridor represented an unsafe geological cavity. That explanation might have worked if not for one detail. Before the entrance was sealed, Jonah had secretly removed a small vessel from one of the niches. He kept it wrapped in flour cloth inside his bedroom. The vessel was only 8 inches tall. Its surface carried the 7-rayed symbol again. But beneath the symbol were 4 figures. They looked almost like letters. Jonah could not read them. Neither could the sheriff. What happened next became one of the first pieces of evidence Millicent Halloway would discover decades later. 2 weeks after the corridor was closed, a black automobile appeared outside Jonah Bell's farm. A man stepped out wearing a dark suit. He asked for the pottery. Jonah refused. The man offered him $50. Jonah still refused. Then the man looked toward the ridge. "You really don't want to keep that thing in your house?" Jonah finally asked who had sent him. The stranger smiled. "Someone who knows what was found in 1897. That was the first indication that Elias Trent's buried structure had never been forgotten. Someone had been keeping track. The pottery never reached a museum. Jonah Bell hid it beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom, where it remained for almost 30 years. He told his wife not to touch it. He told his sons not to mention it, and whenever anyone asked about the corridor beneath the ridge, Jonah gave the same answer. County men said it was a sinkhole, but Jonah knew it wasn't. So did Elias Trent. For the next decade, the two men occasionally met in private. They never became friends exactly. They were too different for that. Elias was quiet and suspicious. Jonah talked too much when nervous and had a habit of rubbing his left thumb across his wedding ring. Still, they shared one certainty. Whatever had been beneath the ridge was connected to whatever Elias had found in 1897. Then in 1919 another discovery made that connection harder to dismiss. A railroad crew cutting a new grade through a wooded section of eastern Kentucky broke through a sandstone roof. The foreman expected a natural cavity. Instead, the workers uncovered a rectangular chamber. Inside were fragments of painted plaster, several clay vessels, and a stone platform covered with geometric markings. The chamber was photographed. At least that was what the surviving railroad paperwork later suggested. The photographs themselves were never found. The foreman's notebook contained only 4 words: "Old room, close immediately." The next entry was 12 pages later. The gap bothered Millicent Halloway years afterward. At the time, nobody in the county thought much of it. Kentucky was changing rapidly. Railroads were cutting through hills that had been inaccessible for generations. Coal companies were buying land. Survey crews were moving deeper into hollows that local families had avoided. Old things were being uncovered everywhere. Most were ordinary. This was not. In 1931, a university survey, a team visited the region after hearing rumours about the underground chamber. They stayed 2 days. Then they left. Their report described the cavity as a naturally modified sandstone formation containing later human disturbance. There was no mention of pottery, no mention of painted walls, no mention of the symbol. But one junior surveyor kept a private notebook. His name was Harold Pike. Inside it, he drew the same circle Elias had seen 34 years earlier. 7 lines. Around it, Pike wrote, "Repeated at all 3 locations." Then, beneath that, architecture appears deliberate. The notebook should have disappeared with him. Instead, it eventually reached his daughter, and from her, decades later, it reached a university archive. That was where Millicent Halloway first saw it. She was 46 years old when she found the drawing. By then, she had spent years studying Appalachian land records and forgotten settlement histories. She had not been looking for a lost civilization. She wasn't even looking for underground structures. She was researching her father's field notes. One afternoon, while sorting through an uncatalogued box, she opened Pike's notebook. The 7-rayed circle stared back at her. Millicent recognized it immediately, not because she had seen the symbol in a textbook, because her father had drawn the same symbol in the margin of one of his own notebooks. Underneath it he had written a single sentence: "Ask why they always seal the second room." Millicent read the sentence twice. Then she turned the page. There was a list of Kentucky counties. Beside each one was a date, and beside the dates were initials. Some of those initials belonged to men who had officially never investigated anything underground at all. Millicent Halloway spent the winter of 1964 trying to prove her father had been wrong. That was how she approached the problem. Not as a believer, as a historian. She kept 3 sharpened pencils beside her typewriter and refused to put anything into her notes unless she could identify where it came from. County deed, railroad survey, newspaper clipping, family letter, court record, everything needed a source. The first month produced almost nothing. The second produced too much. A 1923 geological report mentioned an irregular subsurface cavity near a farm in eastern Kentucky. A 1931 university survey referred to unusual masonry. A county road document from 1948 described a construction delay caused by an unstable underground chamber. 3 different locations, 3 different decades, and beside 2 of them, someone had written the same 7-rayed circle. Millicent began plotting the sites on a paper map. They formed a rough line along the Appalachian ridges. That was when she found the 1952 road survey. The document described a road project in Tennessee. The survey crew had been cutting into a wooded slope when a bulldozer broke through the ground. The operator dropped nearly 10 feet before the machine stopped against a stone floor. The county engineer ordered the area cleared. The surviving report described a chamber approximately 40 feet long. It mentioned sandstone walls, a vaulted ceiling, painted plaster, and figural representations of uncertain origin. Millicent stared at that phrase. Uncertain origin, not Native American, not colonial, not prehistoric, just uncertain. She requested the original field photographs. The archive replied that none were available. She requested the engineer's personal notes. Missing. She requested the names of the labourers. Only 3 remained in the records. 1 had died. 1 had moved to Ohio. The 3rd was listed as unavailable. Millicent drove to Tennessee anyway. The road that replaced the original survey route was narrow and heavily wooded. She parked beside a creek nearly 2 miles from the nearest paved highway and walked the final stretch. The old survey marker was still there. A rusted iron post beside a slope covered in rhododendron and fallen leaves. Nothing about it suggested a hidden chamber. That was what disturbed her. The mountains had a way of swallowing evidence. A collapsed roof became a hill. A road covered an old trail. A farmhouse could stand over a cellar for generations without anyone asking what came before it. Millicent spent the afternoon searching the slope. Near sunset, she found a rectangular depression beneath the leaves. She cleared away the debris with her hands. Stone appeared. Dressed sandstone. She stopped breathing for a moment. Then she saw the symbol. 7 lines inside a circle. Someone had carved it into the stone decades earlier. Not ancient. The edges were too sharp. Someone investigating the chamber had copied the original mark. Millicent photographed it and returned to her car. Before leaving, she noticed something else. A few yards downhill stood a concrete drainage pipe. It had been installed during the road construction. Millicent crouched beside it. The pipe disappeared into the earth. From inside came a faint draft. Cold air moved across her face. She listened. Nothing. Then came a sound from somewhere beyond the pipe. Not a voice, not an animal. 3 slow knocks. Millicent stood immediately. She did not investigate. Instead, she wrote the time in her notebook, 6:17 p.m. Underneath it, she wrote 4 words. Sound from sealed chamber. Then she drew the 7-rayed symbol. For the first time, she began to wonder whether her father's notes had it had been a collection of unrelated curiosities. They might have been fragments of the same story. By 1967, Millicent Halloway had stopped asking whether the buried structures were connected. She was asking how many there were. Her father's notebook became the center of the investigation. It had belonged to Thomas Halloway, a county historian who had spent much of his life collecting material nobody else considered important. He saved funeral notices, old land deeds, surveyor mistakes, handwritten recipes, church minutes, and letters written by people who had died decades before Millicent was born. He had never published his findings. Near the back of the notebook, Millicent found 11 pages marked with the same phrase, "Do not rely on the official report." Some pages contained names, others contained dates. One listed an excavation in Kentucky in 1897. Elias Trent. Millicent circled the name. She had seen it before. A 1901 county agricultural document mentioned Trent's farm and referred briefly to subsurface masonry encountered during cultivation. Nothing else, no explanation, no correction, no archaeological report. Millicent travelled to Blackwater that summer. The town had changed since Elias's time. The old general store was gone. The dirt road into the Trent property had become a narrow gravel lane, and the tobacco fields had largely given way to hardwood and pasture. But Elias's granddaughter, Ruth Trent, still lived nearby. She was 73. She received Millicent on a screened porch overlooking the ridge. Ruth had never met her grandfather. She had been born 2 years after his death. But she remembered what he had told her as a child. He didn't like that field. Why? Ruth folded her hands in her lap. He said the ground wasn't empty. Millicent showed her a photograph of the 7-rayed symbol. Ruth's expression changed. My grandfather drew that. Where? In the back of his Bible. Ruth disappeared into the Appalachian house and returned carrying a small black book wrapped in a dish towel. Inside the back cover was a faded pencil drawing, the same circle, the same 7 lines. Underneath it, Elias had written, "Door remains shut." Millicent felt her pulse quicken. Did he ever tell you what was behind it? Ruth shook her head. Only once. What did he say? He said men came from Washington and took things away. Millicent asked whether Elias had ever described what those things were. Ruth looked toward the ridge. He said one of them wasn't an artifact. What did he mean? I don't know. That answer stayed with Millicent. Before leaving, Ruth gave her something else. A letter. It had been written by Elias in 1926, but never mailed. The recipient's name was Professor Nathaniel Vale. Millicent read it twice. Elias had written that he had heard of another underground discovery and wanted to know whether Vale was involved. The letter ended with one sentence. You told me in 1897 that some things were better left buried. I have spent 30 years wondering whether you meant the stones or what was living beyond them. Millicent looked up. Did you know about this? Ruth shook her head. No. Then why did your grandfather keep it? Ruth gave a small, tired smile. Maybe because he wanted somebody to find it. That evening, Millicent returned to her motel and spread every document across the bed. The Kentucky sites, the Tennessee chamber, the railroad records, Elias Trent, Nathaniel Vale, her father's notes. Then she placed them on a map. One by one. The marks followed the ridges. Not roads. Not rivers. Ridges. And when Millicent connected the first 7 locations, the line continued westward into Kentucky and eastward toward Virginia. There were far more sites than she had expected, and the 7-rayed symbol appeared beside almost Eva. Rye 1. Millicent spent the next 6 years building a map that eventually covered an entire wall of her study. It began with 7 locations, then 14, then 23. By 1973, she had documented 31 reports from Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia that shared at least one unusual feature: a buried chamber, dressed stonework, an underground corridor, unusual pottery, painted surfaces, or a recurring geometric symbol. She was careful with the language. She never called them ruins. She called them reported sites. Some were supported by photographs, some by survey records. Some existed only in family testimony. Several were nothing more than a paragraph in an old newspaper. But the pattern kept growing. At least 11 reports mentioned institutional visitors arriving shortly after a discovery. 8 described artifacts being removed. 6 mentioned the landowner receiving money. 4 contained references to sealed entrances, and 3 included documents that appeared to have been altered after the original discovery. Millicent began writing letters. Most were ignored, some were returned. One came back with a handwritten note across the envelope. Please stop asking about this matter. She kept it. Then she found the oldest surviving reference outside Kentucky. A 1903 letter written by a surveyor in West Virginia described stone passages beneath the ridge and mentioned a vessel decorated with a circular design divided by 7 spokes. The surveyor had asked a university professor for an opinion. The professor's reply was short. Do not publish this. Millicent read the sentence several times. Then she found something even stranger. A private collection in Virginia contained photographs taken in 1911 inside a chamber beneath an abandoned farm. The images were poor. The negatives had deteriorated, but one showed a stone wall covered in painted figures. Human shapes stood beside animals. Above them was the familiar circle. 7 lines. The photograph had been catalogued simply as unknown underground structure. No location, no excavation report, no explanation. Millicent traced the photographer through family records and eventually contacted his grandson. The man lived outside Roanoke. He remembered his grandfather talking about the chamber. He said the people who found it weren't supposed to photograph anything. Who were the people? My grandfather never said. Did he describe what they found? The grandson thought for a while. He said there were rooms behind the rooms. Millicent wrote that sentence down. Then she asked the question that had been bothering her for years. Did he ever say who built it? The man shook his head. No. After a pause he added, he said the walls were older than anything around them. That was not proof of anything. Millicent knew that. The Appalachian Mountains contained countless abandoned mines, shelters, caves, foundations, and forgotten structures. People misidentified things, memories changed, documents disappeared for ordinary reasons. But the number of similarities was becoming difficult to ignore. She transferred every reported site onto a large topographic map. Then she traced the Appalachian ridgelines beneath them. The alignment became unmistakable. The sites did not form a perfect line. They formed clusters connected by the same high ridges. The pattern reminded her of something she had once seen in an old survey manual. Routes chosen because they avoided steep valleys. But these sites predated the roads by centuries, perhaps longer. Millicent stood before the map late one night with a ruler in her hand. She drew another line. It passed through Elias Trent's farm, then Jonah B. Bell's corridor, then the Tennessee chamber, then several locations whose original reports had vanished. At the center of the map, 7 lines converged. Millicent stepped backward. She had spent years trying not to believe in a hidden civilization. Now she had a different problem. The evidence did not prove one existed, but it did suggest that somebody, somewhere, had known these places were connected, and someone had been quietly removing pieces of the pattern before historians could see the whole thing. Millicent's most controversial evidence came from a man who had spent his entire career telling people not to confuse unanswered questions with proof. His name was Dr. Arthur Wren. He was 81 years old when Millicent found him living alone in a small house outside Lexington, Kentucky. His shelves were crowded with dictionaries, field notes, and boxes of correspondence from universities that had long since changed their names. Wren had been a linguist. In 1938 he had been shown photographs of inscriptions copied from an underground chamber in eastern Tennessee. The photographs themselves were gone. Wren's notes were not. Millicent found them in a private collection. Most pages contained ordinary linguistic observations. Then she found a page marked 7 Roads. Underneath were several copied characters. Wren had written that the inscriptions did not match any known Appalachian writing system, but he had also warned against an extraordinary conclusion. The symbols, he wrote, showed structural similarities to certain ancient Near Eastern script traditions. Similarity was not origin. Similarity was not migration. And it certainly wasn't proof that an ancient civilization had crossed an ocean. Millicent understood the distinction. She asked Wren about it when she finally met him. He sat beside a coal stove and listened while she described the Kentucky discoveries. When she finished, he said, "You think they're connected? I think somebody believed they were." "That isn't the same thing." "I know." Wren smiled faintly. "That answer may save you from making a fool of yourself." Millicent placed a photocopy of his old notes on the table. "What's this phrase?" Wren looked at it. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he adjusted his glasses. "I never translated it. You wrote House of the 7 Roads. I wrote that it migged. That means something like that." "Why?" "Because of the repeated symbol." He tapped the page. 7 radiating lines. If the inscription referred to roads, paths, divisions, directions, ritual routes, anything like that, the symbol could have been associated with the phrase. "Could have been?" "Yes." Millicent leaned forward. "Did you believe it was connected to the chambers?" Wren looked towards the window. "I believed the people who showed me those photographs were frightened." "Who showed them to you?" "I don't remember." "You don't remember?" "Not any more." He closed the notebook. Then he said something Millicent hadn't expected. "They didn't want me to translate it." "Who?" Wren's eyes settled on her. "The men who brought the photographs." "What did they say?" "That if I found something that contradicted the accepted history of the region, I was to report it privately." Millicent felt a heaviness settle over the room. "Did you?" "Yes." "To whom?" Wren shook his head. "I don't remember." The conversation ended there, but before Millicent left, Wren called her back. He opened a drawer and removed one final page. It contained a handwritten transcription of 4 repeated characters. Beside them was Wren's tentative interpretation, House of the Seven Roads. Below that, in darker ink, someone had written, "Do not circulate." Millicent asked who had written the second line. Wren looked at the handwriting. His face changed. "I don't know." The page was decades old. The ink had faded, but the handwriting looked almost identical to the notes Millicent had found in her father's collection. She drove home that night with the page locked inside her briefcase. For the first time she began to consider a possibility more disturbing than a forgotten settlement. Perhaps the mystery wasn't only who had built the chambers, perhaps the reassize. Belle's story was about the people who had spent generations deciding what other people were allowed to know. By the spring of 1968, Millicent Halloway had stopped asking whether the buried chambers were connected. She was asking how far the connection went. For nearly 20 years, she had collected scraps other researchers had ignored: county survey notes, handwritten letters, photographs with no captions, newspaper stories printed in towns that no longer existed, and copies of reports that had been quietly amended years after the original discoveries. Most were useless, a few were strange. 7 were impossible to dismiss. Everyone involved an underground structure somewhere along the Appalachian ridges, and nearly everyone ended the same way. Someone arrived, someone removed something, someone changed the paperwork. Then the entrance disappeared. Millicent spread the documents across the dining room table of her father's old house in Lexington. She had marked every location on a large topographic map with small black pins: Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia. At first the pins looked scattered. Then she stepped back. They weren't. Several followed the same mountain corridors, almost as if the people who built the original structures had understood the landscape in a way later settlers never did. The distances between some sites were remarkably consistent: 31 miles, 27, 43, 36, not enough to prove anything, but enough to bother her. Her father had always warned her against turning patterns into conclusions. "People see shapes in clouds," he used to say. "They'll see them in paperwork too." Millicent remembered that as she drew a pencil line between 2 locations. Then she found the third. The line continued almost perfectly along the ridge. She sat down. For several minutes she did nothing. On the table beside her lay a photocopy of the 1897 Kentucky excavation notes. The original had disappeared out years earlier, but one surviving page contained a measurement Elias Trent had supposedly made himself. 6 feet beneath the field, 42 feet from the eastern fence, a dressed stone wall, a sealed wooden door, and beside the measurement was a symbol Millicent had seen before: a circle, 7 lines extending outward. She looked back at the map, then at the symbol. There were now 23 black pins on the table. She counted them twice. 23 reported underground discoveries, 23 sites where the documentary trail became strangely thin. But there was something else. In the margin of an old surveyor's notebook, someone had written a sentence that Millicent had previously dismissed as a private remark. She read it again, then a third time. "The roads beneath the ridges appear to meet." Millicent slowly folded the notebook shut. For the first time she wondered whether Elias Trent had never discovered a buried building at all. He might have uncovered one entrance to something much larger. And if the old map was correct, there could be dozens of other entrances still buried beneath farms, forests, churches, and abandoned roads. The disturbing part was no longer what might be underground. It was the possibility that someone had known exactly where those entrances were and had spent 70 years making sure nobody else did. Millicent did not publish the map, not yet. Instead, she began looking for the people who had been closest to the original excavations. Most were dead. Some left no surviving records. One name, however, kept appearing in places where it shouldn't have: Thomas R. Bell. In 1897, Bell had been 26 years old and working as a labourer on excavation crews around central Kentucky. His name appeared only once in the surviving county records, attached to a payment for earth removal and stonework. After that, nothing. Millicent spent 6 months searching for him. Then, in October of 1968, she found him. He was 97 years old and living with his daughter in a small house outside Elizabethtown. The road to the house narrowed into gravel before disappearing between two stands of walnut trees. There was no mailbox with his name on it. His daughter had written the number on a piece of cardboard and nailed it to a fence post. When Millicent introduced herself, the old man stared at her for several seconds. Then he looked at the folder beneath her arm. "You got his papers?" "Whose?" "Trent's." Millicent stopped. She had not mentioned Elias Trent. The old man's daughter looked toward the kitchen. Her father had already turned away. They sat in a room warmed by a coal stove. A clock above the doorway ticked loudly enough to become uncomfortable. Millicent placed a photograph on the table. It showed the Kentucky excavation site as it supposedly looked in 1897. Bell leaned toward it. His hands trembled, but his eyes sharpened. "That's the hill," he whispered. "You remember it?" "I remember the door." Millicent waited. Bell rubbed his thumb against the edge of the photograph. There wasn't supposed to be a door. Who opened it? He looked at her. For several seconds he seemed confused. Then something changed in his expression. Fear. Not the theatrical kind. Something older. "We shouldn't have opened it." Millicent lowered her voice. "What was inside?" Bell's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She waited. He looked toward the window. The room was dry. Dry. Underground, but dry. He swallowed. There were shelves. What was on them? Bell frowned as though trying to retrieve a word from a language he had forgotten. Things. Pottery. He shook his head. Books. Another shake. Then he whispered, "Names." Millicent leaned forward. "Whose names?" Bell stared directly at her. For one brief moment, the 97-year-old man looked completely lucid. People who weren't supposed to be there yet. His daughter entered the room carrying a glass of water. The moment was gone. Bell looked at Millicent without recognition. She tried asking about the excavation again. He only smiled faintly and said that he had never worked on a farm in his life. 3 months later, Thomas Bell died in his sleep. Millicent never learned what he meant by the names, but among his daughter's belongings she found one object that had been hidden inside an old tobacco tin. A brass tag. 7 narrow lines were engraved around a circle. On the reverse was a date, 897, and beneath it 4 words, "The lower road continues." Millicent Halloway never found the lower road. She spent the final 12 years of her career trying. The brass tag from Thomas Bell became the centerpiece of her investigation, but it never gave her a location. She compared the date, the symbol, and the phrase with every surviving survey she could obtain. Nothing matched. There was no official record of a road beneath the Kentucky Ridge. No archaeological report acknowledged one. No university collection admitted possessing the artifacts Bell had described, and no federal archive contained the name of the researcher who had supposedly arrived at Elias Trent's farm in 1897. That absence eventually became more important to Millicent than any artifact. She wrote one final paper, carefully separating what she could document from what she could only suspect. She did not claim that an ancient civilization had been erased. She did not claim that the inscriptions came from the Near East. She did not claim that government officials had ordered the discoveries buried. Instead, she listed the evidence. 23 reported underground sites, repeated architectural similarities, the 7-lined circular symbol, missing excavation records, witness accounts, artifacts whose later locations could not be established, and a recurring pattern of institutional intervention. Her conclusion was only 7 words long. Someone had decided these discoveries were better left unexplained. The paper was never widely published. Millicent died in 1981. Her father's notebooks passed to a university archive, while the original map remained with her family. Years later, one of her nephews returned to the old Trent property. The farm had changed considerably. The tobacco fields were gone. Hardwood had reclaimed the upper slope. A newer house stood near the county road, while the original farmhouse had collapsed into a depression surrounded by weeds. He walked to the eastern edge of the property, carrying Millicent's map. The fence was gone. But 42 feet beyond where the eastern fence had once stood, he found something. A shallow depression in the ground. Not a sinkhole, not an animal burrow, a straight line beneath the grass. He cleared away the leaves with his boot. Stone appeared underneath. Dressed stone, only a few inches showed. He called the county historical office. They told him not to disturb it. He asked why. The man on the telephone was silent for a moment. Then he said something that had not appeared in any public record. "Because we've been told that site was already investigated." The nephew looked down at the stone. "By who?" Another pause. "We don't have that information. He never excavated. Neither did anyone else. Today the field is covered by trees. No marker identifies what may lie beneath it. No official excavation has established what Elias Trent uncovered in 1897. The door he described was never recovered. The chambers Millicent mapped remain unverified, and the seven-spoked symbol remains exactly what it has always been, a recurring mark attached to a collection of discoveries whose meaning nobody can conclusively explain. But there is one surviving sentence from Elias Trent's granddaughter. She remembered sitting beside him as a child while he watched snow settle over the old tobacco field. She asked him why he never planted that section again. He answered without looking at her, "Because that field isn't the ground." More than a century later, the trees have grown over the place where he stood. The soil looks ordinary, the ridge looks ordinary. And somewhere beneath it, if the old measurements were correct, 6 feet of earth still separates the surface from a stone wall that should never have been there. Nobody knows whether the door is still intact. Nobody knows what was behind it. But if Thomas Bell remembered one thing correctly, the lower road did not end at Elias Trent's farm. It continued, and whatever built it may still be waiting beneath the ridges, not for someone to find the entrance, but for someone to keep digging.